the evidence is on that. So how likely would it be that if there's particles, they behave as waves sometimes as particles, on the assumption of simple atomism, and on the assumption that there's no subatomic particles, and on the assumption that there's nothing at all, just a plenum? Well, I mean, these probabilities are really hard to assess. I don't really know any precise values. But I think it's very plausible that this evidence is less likely on simple atomism than if there were no subatomic particles down there at all. I mean, I think this is the type of evidence that somebody like Zeno would really have liked. You know, you can imagine Zeno here. He's given his arguments against motion and so forth, and he says, and furthermore, think about this one. You think there's particles down there? So, sure, sometimes they'd act as particles, but sometimes they'd act as waves, and there's not even a precise number of them. They don't even exist. They don't have a space-time location. This is the type of argument he would like. And you might imagine him giving this in support of a plenum or no particles existing. But this is clearly the wrong result. We don't think the strange behavior of subatomic particles disconfirms quantum mechanics simply because the evidence would be less likely on simple atomism. What's important is that the evidence is handled very well by our modern theory. It doesn't matter what the core says about it. Okay, I want to give one final argument about the core assumption, and that is that it becomes too easy to find evidence that confirms a theory or disconfirms it. In general, suppose you have two competing theories, 1 and 2. To give evidence that supports one, all you need to do is find some evidence that's true and more likely on the core of theory 1 than on the core of theory 2, or find some evidence that's false and more likely on the core of theory 2 than on the core of theory 1. So let's suppose we're comparing creationism and evolutionary theory. Well, let's let our evidence be that we see species evolving rapidly right before our very eyes. Well, that evidence is false, but it's more likely on the core of evolutionary theory than on the core of creationism. So here we have some evidence that supports creationism. Or suppose I said the evidence is that we don't see God creating new species right before our eyes. Well, that evidence is true, and it's more likely on the core of evolutionary theory than on the core of creationism, so that evidence would support evolutionary theory over creationism. We can easily find evidence to support any theory we want, but it's difficult to see the relevance of this for rational belief. Theories are developed and designed in order to account for evidence, and the developed theory will usually account for evidence that the core is unable to account for. The core of a theory is basically irrelevant to the rationality of believing the theory. What's important is how well the best developed theory handles the evidence. Okay, I now want to shift a bit and talk about the probabilistic assumption. Now, according to this, the probabilities we should use in philosophy of religion are not personal probabilities, but they're some sort of objective probabilities, conditional on some agreed upon public evidence. And often these are called epistemic probabilities. And furthermore, rational belief is supposed to be closely connected with these probabilities, and they're accessible by reason alone. Now, one immediate problem is that it's not clear that these probabilities exist. No detailed account of them has survived scrutiny. But let's just suppose they exist and can be adequately explicated. What I think is there's still problems in using them in philosophy of religion. Well, according to the probabilistic assumption, these probabilities are assessed by reason alone. Well, one way to reject the probabilistic assumption would just be to view probabilities as personal degrees of belief instead of some objective or logical relation. Another way to reject the probabilistic assumption would be to reject its account of the origin of these probability judgments, to deny that reason alone gives us these probabilities. So on this way of rejecting the probabilistic assumption, the heart, the will, our affections, and our individual experiences affect our probability judgments. Now, there's at least two different ways we could go here. One way would be to claim that the probabilistic assumption is correct, that the relevant probabilities are objective, but that reason alone is unable to access them. You know, perhaps you might think that a rightly directed heart is needed to access the correct objective probabilities. For example, William Wainwright, he appears to read Jonathan Edwards, if I understand him correctly, as saying you have to have a rightly directed heart in order to know what the correct objective probabilities are. A different way, the way I prefer, is just to claim that these objective probabilities are not relevant to rational judgment. So if we're trying to evaluate somebody's probability judgments, we don't judge them by whether they correspond to the objective probabilities out there. So even if the objective probabilities exist, they're not important to our rational judgments. Instead, probability is the logic of partial belief. It acts as a consistency requirement on our judgments. It's just as deductive logic acts as a consistency requirement on our beliefs, that's what probability is. It's like logic. It's a consistency requirement on my judgments. Furthermore, our judgments are not based on reason alone. Our hearts, our wills, our affections, and experience affect our judgments about what is likely to be true. Well, in either of these ways of rejecting the probabilistic assumption, what we see is the heart has an effect on our judgments. And when the heart affects a probability judgment, what it does, it's providing a basic picture of the way the world is. We can view this as a commitment to the world being a certain way. In von Frossen's terminology, the heart adopts a stance. Reason can't always supply a basic picture of the way the world is. That's what the heart, or will, or affection provides. And once we recognize the role of the heart in our probability judgments, the probability assumption in the standard view loses its appeal. So I'd like to look at an example now to illustrate how our heart and experience affect our probability judgments. Plantinga developed what he calls the Aquinas-Calvin model of religious belief, and according to this, God has given us a faculty which in appropriate circumstances allows us to form beliefs, religious beliefs. So if we're looking at a magnificent mountain range, a starry sky, or the Grand Canyon, this faculty may generate us the belief that God exists, or God is worthy of worship. And following Calvin, as you probably all know, he calls this the sensus divinitatis. And this works to various degrees in different people. Some people it works well, some people it doesn't work at all. Because of this, different people will form very different beliefs in situations in which the sensus divinitatis is designed to operate. And whether it operates depends, partially to some degree, on one's heart and affections. As a result of this sensus divinitatis working or not, these people will experience the world very differently. These experiences may affect one's heart or affections, and one's heart and affections may affect what one experiences. And I don't have time today to talk about that. It's way beyond the scope of this paper. So let's take an example. Suppose we have two climbers looking down the east side of Denali at the Trelica Glacier. When I wrote this, I planned to bring in a visual aid and project a big slide of it up there, and only later I realized I don't have one. So I had pictures from lower down, but nothing from high up looking down the Trelica. But anyway, so pretend it's there. It's quite a spectacular scene, even more so, I think, than most mountain scenery. Well, a climber in who the sensus divinitatis is operating may form very different beliefs than a climber in which the sensus divinitatis is not operating well. An operating sensus divinitatis will cause the climber to experience the world differently than a climber in who the sensus divinitatis is not working well. And these two climbers will have very different